Using Stochastic tool for investigating risks of CVD and CKD, number 1546, VPT 099, February 23, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category CVD, CKD and methodology. Preface. During the past few days, I investigated my risks of CVD and resulting from both obesity BMI and diabetes EG across a 17-year period from 2010 to 2026. I applied for different research approaches to the same core problem, the descriptive narrative in paper No.1543, the topology method in No.1544, the viscoplastic energy method in No.1545, and the stochastic method in this paper No.1546. Each method reveals different details, yet the overall findings and conclusions are highly consistent across all four models. This is important. When independent methods converge toward the same hierarchy and the same long-term story, it becomes less likely that the result is a mathematical artifact. Instead, it becomes more likely that the result reflects a governing structural mechanism inside the body. My medical research work is about making invisible pathophysiology visible and actionable. If a concept cannot guide daily decisions, then it is not useful for prevention. The stochastic method is not introduced to impress anyone. It is introduced to answer a simple real-life question: if the body is naturally fluctuating and measurements are never perfect, then how confident can I be about the energy hierarchy and the long-term structural interpretation? Introduction. Living biological tissues exposed to chronic metabolic stress exhibit both time-dependent and path-dependent behavior. Their present condition depends not only on the current input but also on the entire history of accumulated load. This is the fundamental reason why static, threshold-based medical interpretation cannot fully describe the progression of chronic conditions and mortality-related diseases, especially for long-duration disorders such as obesity, diabetes, vascular disease, kidney disease, stroke, dementia, and cancer. Most clinical judgments are made to be comparing today's test results against a threshold. That approach is practical for acute decisions, but it often fails to explain slow progression and delayed outcomes. A single test is a snapshot. A long record is a movie. Chronic disease behaves like a structure under load, and structural behavior is controlled by cumulative exposure, timing, and load history. That is why the same normal value can mean different things in different years, depending on what the body has already experienced. The studies presented here are not population statistics. They represent longitudinal system identification based on dense and continuous measurements within a single, well-instrumented biologic system, my own body. Over 17 years from 2010 to 2026, within this closed validation and feedback loop, daily life, continuous data collection, mathematical modeling, and clinical outcomes verify one another in real time. The objection to N=1 applies to population generalization, but it does not apply to identifying governing mechanisms in a complex system that is both time-dependent and path-dependent. Moreover, my research is not anti-statistics. Many of my previous studies have already used large public datasets N=many to validate the methodology itself. In other words, I have used population data to validate the research tool, and I use my long-term personal record to observe and quantify the system behavior in a way that is impossible to see from snapshots. In this paper, I apply a stochastic framework to study two major mortality diseases, cardiovascular disease CVD and chronic kidney disease CKD, using two dominant metabolic input drivers, obesity, represented by body mass index BMI, and diabetes, represented by estimated average glucose EG. Based on more than 1,500 prior written biomedical research papers, the long-term trajectory had already revealed the qualitative conclusions through pattern recognition. The purpose of this stochastic extension is just to quantify the uncertainty range, validate the structural relationships, and communicate the results in a form that engineers and scientists immediately understand and patients can intuitively grasp as total load over time. In plain terms, stochastic analysis adds uncertainty awareness to a deterministic result. Even as a trained scientist and engineer, I recognize that every measurement device has built-in error, and the human body itself is a fluctuating system. Therefore, uncertainty arises from two sources: instrument error and physiological variability. These two sources justify applying a stochastic method to deterministic studies, because the real question is not whether a model can produce one clean number, but whether the model's conclusion remains valid when the real world is allowed to fluctuate. Stochastic method, to account for physiological variability and long-term uncertainty in measured datasets. I introduced a simple stochastic extension into the subject of Parkinson's diseases using both topology and VMT energy model. For each input stress x BMI or EG, the measured annual value is expressed as x equals mu plus epsilon, or mu is the long-term average value of the time series, and epsilon represents the natural yearly fluctuation around that mean average. This single line captures the basic idea that measured values contain a stable center plus a fluctuation band. The size of this uncertainty is quantified by sigma, defined as the standard deviation of the same time series. Sigma equals SQ or T sum x underscore I mu to 1 in plain language. Sigma tells us how much a value moves up and down around its long-term average. To obtain it, I first calculate the average of the multi-year data. I then measure how far each annual value is from that average and determine the typical size of those differences. In this equation, x represents either BMI or EG, one at a time, not both together. I apply the same calculation separately to BMI to obtain the uncertainty band for body weight, and separately to EG to obtain the uncertainty band for glucose. Therefore, BMI and EG each have their own mu average, epsilon variation or fluctuation, and sigma standard deviation. For readers, the key point is not the symbols. The key point is what sigma represents. It is the width of the fluctuation band around the long-term average. No random simulation was required in this paper. Instead, 3 deterministic stress levels were used to represent the stochastic band. 1 low stress equals mu minus sigma to mid stress equals mu. 3 high stress equals mu plus sigma. These 3 stress levels are then paired with the same strain rate framework used in the deterministic VMT analysis. The strain rate of disease risk is not changed, because it is governed by the observed annual trajectory of CVD risk and CKD risk. The stochastic component modifies only the stress term by replacing one deterministic stress value with a 3-level stress band. These stress levels are multiplied by the corresponding strain rate to obtain a 3-level energy band: low energy, expected energy, and high energy. The purpose is to convert a single energy number into a physiologically meaningful uncertainty range. Numerical results of sigma from the full 2010 to 2026 annual data. The results are for BMI mu underscore BMI equals 26.01 SIGMA underscore BMI equals 2.05. This produces 3 BMI stress levels: low equals 23.96, mid equals 26.01, high equals 28.06. For EG, mu underscore EG equals 138.4 milligrams, idle sigma peak equals 57.0 milligrams. DLTHIs produces 3 AG stress levels: low equals 81.4 milligrams, DLMID equals 138.4 milligrams, DLHIGH equals 195.4 milligrams DL. At this stage, I keep the full period mu and sigma because they describe the full historical narrative. However, I do not treat full period sigma as a realistic fluctuation band for the controlled era, because it is dominated by the large deterministic transition from very high glucose in the early years 2010 to 2013 to much lower glucose in later years 2014 to 2006. That transition is real and important, but it is not the same as fluctuation around a stable controlled state. Therefore, for a more realistic stochastic model of present metabolic stability, I compute a second set of mu and sigma using the stabilized control period of 2014 to 2026. These stabilized period results are: BMI 2014 to 2026, mu equals to 5.2 to sigma equals 0.7 to low equals 24.50, mid equals 25.2 to high equals 25.9. For EG 2014 to 2026, mu equals 111.65 milligrams, DLSIGMA equals 11.75 milligrams DL. Low equals 99.90 milligrams, IL mid equals 111.65 milligrams, DLI equals 123.40 milligrams. DLTHI's controlled period of 2014 to 2026, high EG of about 123 milligrams. DL matches my lived reality far better than 195 milligrams DL, because it represents true biological fluctuation around a controlled metabolic era, not the full historical swing across 17 years since 2010. The full period sigma tells the recovery story. The stabilized period sigma tells the stability story. A note on data integrity is necessary. These values may shift slightly if any yearly data in the dataset differ from what is shown. In particular, Early year EEG values may be partially obscured in attached tables, and those early values were likely on or above 200 mg DL during my poorly controlled diabetes years. This is exactly why separating historical transition from stabilized fluctuation is physically meaningful. Physiological interpretation: the smaller sigma size of uncertainty of BMI indicates a highly stable body weight control system over the long term. Especially during the controlled metabolic era after 2014, this stability has practical value. Because stable weight implies stable baseline metabolic load and less uncertainty. The relatively larger sigma size of uncertainty of EEG in the full 2010 to 2026 period does not represent metabolic instability. Instead, it reflects the long-term transition from severe hyperglycemia to near normal glucose levels, which also corresponds to major structural recovery of my diabetes metabolic system. Therefore, the stochastic band awful history EEG captures recovery trajectory rather than random fluctuation. For present-day uncertainty and risk stability, the stabilized period sigma is the appropriate representation of real physiological variability under control. This dual sigma concept is important. A large sigma can mean two very different things. It can mean instability, or it can also mean recovery across a long distance, in my case. The full period EEG sigma mainly represents recovery distance, while the controlled period EEG sigma represents real fluctuation within a controlled state. Stochastic results and energy hierarchy. The stochastic extension was applied to the same VMT strain stress framework used in the deterministic analysis. The strain trajectories of CVD risk and CKD risk remain unchanged because they are governed by observed annual disease paths. The stochastic component modifies only the stress term by applying low, mid, and high stress levels to sigma uncertainty systems where examined. The full 17-year sigma reflects the entire metabolic history, including early severe diabetes and later tight control, and therefore it represents the total recovery span. The stabilized period sigma reflects true stochastic fluctuation are on a controlled metabolic state and is used as the primary stochastic band for energy reliability. Using the stabilized period of 2014 to 2026, my input stress levels are BMI low 24.50, mid 25.22, high 25.9 for EG low 99.90 mg DL, mid 111.65 mg DL, high 123.40 mg DL. These stress levels were multiplied by the previously defined strain rates of CVD risk and CKD risk to produce stochastic VMT energy ranges. For CVD, the strain trajectory shows a continuous long-term reduction in risk. When the stochastic stress band is applied, the EEG energy band remains larger than the BMI energy band across the three stress levels, low, mid, high. The separation becomes wider under the high-stress condition, which means that even when uncertainty is considered, glucose remains the dominant driver of cardiovascular structural evolution in this dataset. For CKD, the strain trajectory also shows long-term reduction, with a slightly different slope that reflects the different response of renal microvascular structures. After applying the stochastic stress band, the energy hierarchy remains unchanged as well. The EEG-driven energy band is consistently higher than the BMI-driven energy band across low, mid, and high levels. BMI contributes a smaller and narrower energy band, which matches the observation of stable body weight after 2014. Therefore, the key hierarchy remains unchanged. EEG is more important than BMI for both CVD and CKD in this 17-year system, and that hierarchy survives uncertainty. The width of the stochastic energy band represents uncertainty. For BMI, the band is narrow because sigma size of uncertainty is small, confirming high stability of weight control during the controlled metabolic era. For EEG, the band is wider than BMI but still physiologically realistic within a well-controlled diabetic state. And narrow energy band means higher stability and higher predictability of disease trajectory, which corresponds to lower probability of sudden structural deterioration. Conclusion: this stochastic extension does not change the deterministic VMT findings. Instead, it converts a single calculated energy value into a physiologically meaningful energy band that represents metabolic stability and the uncertainty range of long-term disease progression. By separating the full 17-year historical transition from the stabilized metabolic period after 2014, this study distinguishes two physical meanings of sigma size of uncertainty, the large sigma from T. The full dataset reflects the magnitude of recovery from severe hyperglycemia to near normal glucose The smaller sigma size of uncertainty from the stabilized period represents true biological fluctuation of a well-controlled metabolic system. This distinction matters because chronic disease progression is governed by long-term load history, while present structural failure risk depends on the stability of the current load. When the stochastic stress levels were applied to the VMT strain stress framework, the energy hierarchy remained unchanged across the entire uncertainty range for both CVD and CKD. Diabetes, represented by EG, produced a larger viscoplastic energy than obesity, represented by BMI. This confirms that diabetes has been the primary driver of cardiovascular and renal structural evolution in this 17-year longitudinal system, while body weight has remained secondary and highly stable during the controlled metabolic era. More importantly, the narrowing of the stochastic energy band after 2014 provides a direct quantitative measure of improved metabolic stability. In engineering terms, cumulative damage has already been reduced, the current applied load has been stabilized, and the probability of sudden failure has been lowered. In physiological terms, long-term glucose control has transformed a high-risk metabolic environment into a predictable and structurally protected state for both the vascular system and the renal microc. IRCULATON. This is the central message of this work. Chronic diseases are not governed by isolated laboratory thresholds but by total metabolic load applied over time and by the stability of that load. The stochastic VMT energy band makes this invisible pathophysiology visible. It translates daily lifestyle control into a measurable reduction in structural failure probability. In practical language, sustained control of glucose over many years does not merely improve a number on a laboratory report. It continuously reduces the internal burden on blood vessels and on the filtering units of the kidney, increases system stability, and lowers the chance of catastrophic events in the future. This is how invisible pathophysiology becomes visible, measurable, and actionable in daily life. In reality, data collected through measurement devices are never 100% accurate. In addition, the human body is a fluctuating system. Therefore, so-called deterministic results always contain a certain degree of uncertainty. On this basis, a stochastic method always has value. Most importantly, this is the reason my CVD and CKD have not returned since 2014. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.